RB and Red Bull, about the connection between the two, and the fact that RB might actually be benefiting. And by the looks of a couple of days of testing, it does seem like they have benefited. Well, what do you think about the whole thing?
Yeah, I think it's been going on for more than just the last few weeks. Zak Brown's been talking about this all winter and all of last season as well. And it relates to the fact that VCarb, as they're called now, previously AlphaTauri, and prior to that, Scuderia Toro Rosso, are owned by the same parent company that owns Red Bull Racing. So, i.e., Red Bull GmbH own both Red Bull, the A team, as you might want to call it, and currently VCarb, or the B team. And under the current cost cap regulations, Zak Brown is contending that there is an advantage to be had by one owner owning two separate teams that are both competing in the same competition. And his whole contention to this is that in no other sport is that allowed, and he's given some examples of that. And this all came to a head because very interestingly, and completely not by accident, in the team principals press conference, we had Christian Horner of Red Bull, Zak Brown of McLaren, and Laurent Mekies of VCarb, all sitting in the same press conference, able to have a little banter with each other. And how did that go down? What did you think, Ammar?
Yeah, so I think I mean, outside of the drama that's been there, and there's been something about Zak Brown and Christian Horner being in the press conference at the same time, right? That happened last year, I believe at Austin, when all of
Yeah.
the cost cap implications and decisions had sort of come through. I couldn't agree more with Zak Brown, and I'm frankly surprised that it has taken as long as it has, and I'm not even sure it's still a frontline topic, but this absolutely should be a topic of contention. Once you put in the cost cap in place, antitrust becomes a big issue, right? Like there is just no other way around it. And the fact that one owner owns two teams, I mean, you can argue that maybe even Red Bull had the opportunity to benefit from it, although that'd be hard to prove. But that's not hard to sort of speculate, right? That they benefit from having certain things being done with AlphaTauri or whatever it was before then, and now it is, Visa Cash RB. Um, has that in some way benefited Red Bull from additional testing, additional areas of experimentation that we may not even know about? So I am surprised that this is not a big deal. Also, given the fact that we cannot ignore the fact that there was an entry that was banned this year, right? And so Red Bull actually has two teams, whereas Andretti has none. And I'm not saying that that's the reason that Andretti should get in, but you cannot step away or step back from this and say that this is something that can't just sort of go away and that we can sort of wink, nod, and keep moving forward. I think it's absolutely an antitrust issue.
Yeah, okay. So I think we can both agree, right, that owning two teams on the grid is clearly a conflict of interest, and there are clear boundaries that can easily be crossed in terms of intellectual property, sharing of the budget cap. All of those things could potentially happen within that situation. But the counter argument to this is that that situation is already there, right? Red Bull GmbH already own two teams. And Christian Horner's argument, the counter argument, which maybe he has labored a little bit too much and made a little bit too much of, but the point is relevant, that if you've already got the situation where one company owns both teams, how do you force that parent company to sell off the second team? Because it's an ownership thing, it's a proprietary issue, right? How do I say to you, Ammar, you've got that hat and it's a conflict of interest with your t-shirt, so I need you to sell the hat. How do you force how do I force you to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, this gets more specific into the bylaws and sort of rules and regulations of it. But I don't know where, if it is Liberty Media that owns it, right, and they're incorporated in the United States, there are laws that specifically do just that. So we've had companies here that have been broken up primarily because they have been become too big to be able to compete, and they monopolize a certain situation. That certainly isn't the case here. But that's happened elsewhere where you cannot, for example, in the NBA, National Basketball League, up until now, you cannot be a player and have an ownership stake in the same team, or even in a different team for that matter. So I think there are laws out there to do that. But I also think that, we this has to be an issue that Formula One forces. I get it that this has already existed prior to the budget cap being put into place. But when you do put that in place, and that's something that all the teams have agreed to, you do have to level set and make this happen. So there has to be more than one way of forcing it. Again, I don't claim to know what the legal levers are, what the apparatus might be. But look, stranger things have happened, right? And I don't think, again, the fact that Red Bull is dominating also adds fuel to the fire, right? Like we always sort of look at this as, well, uh, the RB team will benefit from it, but I think the opposite is probably more true and less often spoken about, where I think Red Bull has, and oh, by the way, there was a great opportunity to do this, right? There was a great opportunity to do this in 2022 when Red Bull had been found in breach of the cost cap. I think that was the moment there where this stuff could have been forced through a little bit more. I'm not suggesting that it would have happened, but that was really a good opportunity. And that really is the failure, on part of the FIA and Formula One to a great extent there.
Yeah, so I think this is a classic case of we've got a problem, but and we can very clearly define what the problem is, in that the square that you're trying to circle is you don't want to have one company own two teams, but you're already in a situation where a company owns two teams before a particular rule came into effect. Right? So that's the problem. I'm struggling with a solution here. Like, if you want to look at this from a purely romantic point of view, and I think we shouldn't, but that's what Christian Horner's tried to do. It's that Minardi in 2005 were failing. They were going to go out of business, and the FIA and F1 at the time asked Dietrich Mateschitz to stump up the cash to invest in the Faenza team, and he did that, and they're here now because of that investment. But we're now in a position where that team no longer has the same financial burden, that the same doesn't have the same. It's not as vulnerable now as it was back then, right? And actually, it's providing a big advantage to the other team on the grid that's owned by the same company. But how do you tell Red Bull you need to sell your team and force them to do it? And I agree with all of the different permutations that Andretti are around. They're a team that wants to come. They have some credibility. They're an easy team to sell to. But how do you make anyone sell something to somebody else?
Well, the only other way to do this is sort of passive aggressively, right? Is to tighten the rules and scrutinize the two teams even more to see if there are any shared advantages. And I say that knowing full well that that will be flawed. Like there is no way to 100% legislate and then police all of those efforts, right? But I think that would be the passive aggressive way of doing that. I would really hope that, for the same reasons that you mentioned, that Red Bull is now so well intertwined with Formula One, that they would realize that this is they have a bit of a fiduciary responsibility as one of the top three teams, and arguably one of the top three teams that are synonymous with Formula One, that they would do the right thing by the sport. And oh, by the way, selling the team, we're not telling them to sell Red Bull. We're telling them to sell Visa Cash RB, AlphaTauri, whatever that is, right? And they will get a healthy payout too. So the investment that Dietrich Mateschitz made is actually going to pay out very handsomely. And oh, by the way, no better time to sell than right now. So I agree. I think that there's the carrot approach, there's the stick approach, but the stick approach, if Red Bull doesn't really want to do this, is to over scrutinize the two, and you just create rules that, with the idea that if there are two teams, you just make their life living hell. That's all you can really do.
But I think they're going to do that anyway. And I think what Red Bull will say is that, well, look, we've complied with all of the rules that are available. You can scrutinize us as much as you want, and they can't scrutinize one team more than everybody else. So that as a governance thing, I don't think they can do that.
They can.
And as I say, Red Bull will turn around and say, look, well, we've played by the rules. These are separate companies. They're separate organizations. Sure, they're owned by the same company, but they're separate organizations. So we don't have to do anything. And in terms of the carrot, do it for the good of the sport. There is no good of the sport when it
And
comes
money.
to. They're not going to.
All
The problem with
businesses are
the
done
problem
with
with
an end
the
in mind, right?
yeah, Ammar, the problem with the money argument though is that these companies are now profit making. They're cash cows. So the argument that you can sell and make more money is the same reason why Gene Haas doesn't want to sell Haas. He doesn't want to sell his team because it's making him money without him having to do anything. And it's the same for Red Bull GmbH. Why sell when we can just make money off it without having to put a huge amount of money in? So actually, from a competitive and a financial point of view, it makes no sense for them to do it. It's only tugging at their heartstrings. And we know that Red Bull are ruthless, as they should be. Every Formula One team is. So there's no competitive reason to sell up. So you can't pull at their heartstrings and say, oh, do it for the good of the sport. There is no good of the sport
This
at this
is
point.
exactly why the other teams were upset back in 2022 when Red Bull was not penalized as much as I think almost the entire grid outside of them, outside of the two teams thought they should, right? Because that was the chance to be so punitive that it forces certain conversations like this. And I think that moving forward, that's the only tool left. As flawed as that tool might be, you're absolutely right. There's no other way to make it happen because there's nothing in the bylaws that say that. Unless you go back and ratify some of these rules and policies, and maybe you can with the new agreement maybe coming up. Is it in 26 or is it in 28?
26, there's a Concord
26.
agreement, yeah.
Maybe that's where you open the door to say, okay, well, there cannot be two teams in there, and maybe you give them a year or two thereafter to make an exit plan. Like that's what you got to do. I mean, if the sport has changed,
Yeah.
the other way to go is the other way
Yeah,
around
yeah,
on this,
okay,
which is
I'll
to
take
get
that.
rid of the cost cap or give the other teams a cost cap advantage, some sort of financial advantage to say, okay, if you're going to have two teams, then this is the advantage that we can give to the other team. So then you give Ferrari and Mercedes and McLaren and maybe even Aston Martin an advantage to sort of compete with that. So you level set in that regard. That's the other way to do it.
Yeah, I
And
like
these are all
that.
flawed, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's no easy answer to this. And I think that even that one, yeah, again, nobody's going to sign up to a Concord agreement where there's not a level playing field. But I agree, the fact that one company owns two organizations within the same competition is already not leveling the playing field. However above board that organization is, I totally agree with you that this
Okay.
situation shouldn't happen. But I think the
more.
one point that you made there that was salient was with the Concord agreement coming up, you make it Red Bull's problem. You turn around and you say, actually, the rules are that one organization, one company can't own two teams. So Red Bull, you're in breach of that. So you're going to have to come up with a solution. You either sell the team or we outlaw VCARB. That's it.
Yeah. No,
One of those two things happens.
I think that's the so you have to wait for the next possible time where you can change the constitution or the bylaws or whatever the legal terminology is. But I also think that if Red Bull were on the other side of this, they would be the ones
Oh, yeah.
shouting,
Oh,
screaming
yeah.
in ways that are just so.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
for all the things that Christian Horner says right now. I don't imagine for 1 second if Mercedes had a B team or Williams somehow became a B team to Mercedes that he wouldn't be screaming and shouting and all that he did over the radio that we heard back in 21, right? We would see all of that and all the gamesmanship around there. So I think that if the question is really not about tugging at the heartstrings, the question is about setting the standard. And if Red Bull are about that, then they would be about fair competition. This
Oh, yeah, of
is
course they would.
not coming and saying, oh, well, let's give somebody else a chance. No, that's not the point here. The point is you're running two teams in a cost cap era where every single dollar counts. Every single minute or second in the wind tunnel counts. All of these things are realities of the sport that we've all agreed to in a cost cap generation. So you can't just sit
Yeah.
up here and say that that's it. Yeah, we were already there.
Yeah, so yeah, but I think the reason this isn't enshrined in the rules already is because that situation exists, because it would make VCARB a team and all of their employees and all of their infrastructure illegal in terms of the competition that is Formula One, right? That's why they haven't made that a rule already. But you're right, if you make it the rule for the Concord Agreement in 2026 that you cannot own two teams and be one organization, then you force Red Bull's hand. They then have to decide, are we going to fold the team or are we going to sell it? And then you make it Red Bull's problem. And I agree with that. I'm going to go off on a quick tangent. What about the situation that Ferrari have with Haas? So one of the big points of contention here that Zak Brown brought up quite saliently earlier in the discourse about this was that VCARB or AlphaTauri or whatever were bringing all of their design infrastructure to Milton Keynes, so they were going to be on the same campus. Now he made a big point about that, but they're not the only team that do that. Ferrari and Haas have that already. Haas have a campus in Maranello, and they're already using ex-Ferrari staff, maybe on sabbatical, as part of their technical makeup. So are we going to outlaw that as well?
I think so. I think once you go down this path, then you have to kind of, I mean, you have to get to a point where if there are 10 teams, that they're in 10 separate locations, 10 separate staff with no overlap. Like all of these things have to be essentially 10 unique entities that are competing for the same thing. It will go down that path. Now, maybe it doesn't go in right away, but
Ammar, then they're not unique, right? McLaren, Mercedes, Aston Martin all share the same engine and gearbox,
well, but
right?
engine
So it means that their rear suspension is also the same.
Same.
We saw that on the Aston Martin because they share the same gearbox as the Mercedes.
Well,
they're locked into a push rod rear suspension because that's what Mercedes have got.
I agree with you. I think this is why it's a bit of a going down a slippery slope right now. You are now pushing yourself to the point where you again will need 10 manufacturers, 10 different everything, right? Just sort of think of it that way in a more sort of simplistic, dumbed down way is you're going to go down to a path. I don't know that you do that right away, but I do think, again, the point that Zak Brown has brought up, it eventually will impact himself, right? Because if he is going to continue to be a customer of Mercedes, as conceivable. But then maybe on the other hand, that does open the door up for other engine manufacturers to come in the sport, which then I guess you could see that being beneficial for the sport as a whole. I don't know about competitiveness and how other manufacturers will come. I mean, Audi is coming in, you know.
I think that's very tricky though, right? Because Audi already, we know this week there's been some changes at the top Audi, and already their entry for 2026 is suddenly in question. So encouraging more manufacturers or other companies to come in and build engines and stuff like that is I think that's a massive gamble.
It is.
I don't think you can gamble the future of your sport on the whims of the car manufacturers, and that's really tricky. And I do think it's interesting that it's Zak Brown that's bringing this up because he's the only one of the big four that doesn't have a works engine partnership for 2026. Aston do, Ferrari do, Mercedes do, and Red Bull do. So he's the only one that's out on a limb having to go, well, I don't have my own works partnership. And there's Red Bull GmbH owning two teams. We're going to lose the competitive advantage here. We're already at a disadvantage. So you can understand why it's him that's doing it, because Toto has been very clear in saying this isn't a problem for me, right? Because for them, they're cushy, aren't they? They've got their own chassis, their own engine, and they're very well integrated. They don't need to worry about it. But it will become a bit more of an issue if we find that there is a bit of IP transfer between Red Bull and VCARB. We can already see it in testing that the VCARB 01 looks very much like the RB19 of last season.
That's
So I
the
think,
problem, though, right? I mean, this is
so I
all
do think
about degrees. Yeah.
yeah, I agree that Zak Brown has a really good point. I just, and I think going forwards, that needs to be enshrined in the rules. I just don't know how you enshrine it in the rules without forcing Red Bull to sell up their team. And maybe that is the answer, that you do enshrine it in the rules and force Red Bull to sell up.
I think that buying an engine and certain parts is far different than having two teams, right? The delta between the two is that's not even and so that cannot be the same thing. I do think, yeah, with the new rules, I think that's going to be outlawed in some way. It would be frankly shameful if that didn't happen, right? I don't see any reason why. And again, from a sporting perspective, if you're the sport, what advantage do you have in Red Bull having two teams when you know that there are other teams that are wanting to come in, that Formula One is still, a very suitable business to run, such that it might be looked at by some of these entrants, right? So there's no reason to have Red Bull have two teams. And look, they did step in at a time when they were needed. That's great. And there can be a way to sweeten that deal, but that you stepping in to help in at the time doesn't mean that you can run with two teams. Like that's, and it's not the way compensation, so to speak, works. Maybe there is something in there. Maybe there is a phase out plan to reduce whatever possible inconvenience and damages that Red Bull might perceive they have. And so I think the sport might owe it to them in that regard, but to keep two teams, that just doesn't make any sense.
No. Okay. I think we're both agreed on this, right? That this isn't a workable situation, particularly, especially with the way that the franchise model system is sort of being promoted by F1. That doesn't really work.
It doesn't work.
But as I say, that's the problem. The solution, I think, is tricky. But here you go, F1, FOM. This is your solve. Force it through. And if Red Bull want to keep their team, they don't want to sell up, then sorry, VCarb, you are out. And then those jobs and that infrastructure is on Red Bull's head. There you go.
Really is. Well said.